tonight we want to start with chapter 12, which is the property management chapter. Property management, remember, is another function of being a real estate broker, and it's an important function of being a real estate broker. One of the first things I want to point out to you about property management, and you should put this in your notes probably first thing in this chapter, is this is one of the few things, the few areas where we differentiate between provisional brokers and non-provisional or full brokers in North Carolina. This is one area where you're not allowed to practice as a provisional broker. The best way to think about the functions of a property management person who's a provisional broker is they can only do the same things that an unlicensed person can do when it comes to property management. The functions that a licensed provisional broker can perform in North Carolina as on the property management side are exactly the same things that somebody who doesn't even have a real estate license can perform in North Carolina. So the key to becoming an actual property manager and being paid for property management functions is to do what? To become a full broker, to get rid of that provisional status. And how do you do that? Take the post licensing classes. And how many of them are there? Three. And you have to take them how rapidly or slowly?
At least once a year.
At least once per license anniversary year. Remember, it's tied to your anniversary date, right? Not a set date, but your actual anniversary date. If you want to get rid of it quickly, can you take them all the first year? Absolutely. You become a full or non-provisional broker as soon as you've taken all three of those post-licensing classes. And you can therefore practice property management as soon as you have taken all three of those classes. And I always just kind of put that at the beginning so you're very clear. There are certain things I can't do as a provisional broker, and property management is one of them. And here's the reason. Way back in chapter 7, when we first introduced the idea of agency relationships, we talked about the fact that in not just real estate, but in any kind of situation where somebody represents a client, there are special agency relationships, general agency relationships, and universal agency relationships. You guys remember those three different categories? And you remember I said that as a real estate broker, you're almost always operating which one of those? Special agency, which means you have how much authority? None. That's exactly right. Basically, you speak for your client, but you don't have any actual contractual power over your client. In other words, when you're a listing agent on a property and somebody presents an offer to you, in order for that offer to be accepted and become a contract, the seller themselves has to sign that offer. You can't sign it on behalf of the seller. Does that make sense to everybody? But I gave you one exception. And I said the one time when you'll have more authority than a special agent will be what? Property management. And I said property managers almost always function as general agents. And the reason is that property managers, generally speaking, have the power to bind their clients to a contract. They have the power to sign a contract on behalf of their clients, and it's just as if the client themselves had signed the contract. What contract in particular are property managers going to be signing and binding their client to? Leases. Leases. Leases are the specific ones that property managers are going to be signing on behalf of their clients most of the time. Now they're going to make other sort of executive type decisions about the maintenance of the property and when to fix things and how to authorize those expenditures, because they're really spending their clients' money when they do that. And that's the reason that we don't allow provisional brokers to perform property management. There's too much decision-making authority given to a property manager to entrust that to a provisional broker. All right? So let's take a look at property management, and I'll try to point out the differences in North Carolina law and maybe national type things that you might see on a national exam as we go through. It says the property manager who is the owner's agent must have an active non-provisional real estate broker's license, no provisional brokers. Property manager who is the employee is required to have a real estate license unless the owner of the property is a Chapter C or Chapter S corporation. In other words, any property management function in North Carolina has to be done by a licensed North Carolina non-provisional real estate broker unless, what's the exception? Give me the exception.
Properties in Chapter C or Subchapter C.
They are the employee. And what does that word employee mean? They're paid with what kind of a tax form?
W-2.
Or W-2. They're salaried and they're paid with a W-2. So unless they're the employee of either a Chapter C corporation or a Subchapter S corporation that owns the property. That's going to be most apartment complexes, folks. That's really what we're talking about. If you want to relate it to something in the real world, most apartment complexes are owned by either Chapter C corporations or Subchapter S corporations. So if an apartment complex is owned by one of those kinds of entities, and you really don't need to know a lot about those kinds of entities, you just need to know that there are corporations that are either Chapter C or Chapter S. You just basically need to know that they're corporations. So, if a corporation owns an apartment complex, can they hire somebody who does not have a real estate license to manage their property?
Yes.
Yes. The answer to that is yes. Can any other person or entity in North Carolina hire somebody to manage their property that doesn't have a real estate license?
No.
No. You need to know that exemption because you'll probably see that on a license exam somewhere. Okay? Is everybody good with that exemption? Right? So it's a pretty narrow one. The property has to be owned by a corporation and you have to be the salaried employee of that corporation if you're not going to be a licensed broker. Alright? The definition of a property manager. Here it says a property manager is somebody who preserves the value of an investment property while generating income. What comes first in that equation? Value or generating income? Preserving the value of the property comes first. That's the most important function of a property manager. So give me something that you think might be a big part of preserving the value of a property.
Getting good tenants.
Getting good tenants? Sure. What else?
Maintenance.
Maintenance. That is a big, in fact, that might be the biggest function of a property manager. Don't forget that piece of the puzzle. If you ever serve the property management role, it does no good to maximize income right now at the expense of allowing the property to go downhill, allowing the property to deteriorate, for example. Maintenance and maintaining the value of the property is our first responsibility of the property manager. Generating income is secondary to that. All right? The property management agreement is absolutely necessary. You must have a property management agreement before you can perform any services of a property manager in North Carolina. So the property management agreement is nothing more than an agency agreement. Remember, what do we call an agency agreement when we're dealing with a seller?
Listing agreement?
A listing agreement. The listing agreement is the agency agreement, right? That's the piece of paper, the document, that the client signs with the firm to hire them to represent them. What do we call the agency agreement with a buyer? A buyer agency agreement, right? Call it a buyer agency agreement. What do we call the agency agreement with a landlord? A property management agreement. That's exactly right. So make sure you've got those ideas put together. Agency agreement sounds fancy. It just means the contract that we use to hire somebody to represent us in these different kinds of situations. Property management agreement is nothing more than an employment contract. But you have to have it in place before you can perform any of these functions. You can't just go out there and start representing a property owner and doing management functions if you don't already have a property management agreement in place. That's really important. All right? As I said, they're going to function as a general agent. We do have the same duties, those loads, loyalty, obeying our legal commands from our clients, accountability, disclosure, skill, care, and diligence. The same duties that we owe any fiduciary client, we owe to our landlords when we serve as a property manager. All property management agreements must be in writing from the very beginning. No oral property management agreements. Right? We're not going to go through the exclusive property management agreement because there's not going to be specifics of that document that you're going to be tested on. But if you want to look at what the kind of standardized form looks like, you do have it in the back of your book, and I kind of give you a notation of where to find it right here if you want to take a look at it. But you're not going to get specifics of that agreement the same way you do like the offer of purchase and contract, which is why we more specifically look at the offer of purchase and contract. Okay? Things that should be in any good property management agreement. The description of the property, how long the management agreement is going to be for. Now, one of the things to note about the length of time here, the broker is not authorized to advertise the property for sale and negotiate a sale. It's not the same thing, folks. Often brokers confuse it. They get mad. I had a lady in a CE class a couple months ago, and she said, you know, I called the real estate commission to file a complaint, and I couldn't believe they didn't do anything. And I said, well, what was your complaint? She said, well, I've been managing this property for the last 10 years, and I pulled up in front of it one day, and there's somebody's for sale sign sitting out in front of it, and I didn't know anything about it, and was just blown away. I said, blown away by what? And she said, well, you know, obviously, if anybody's going to be selling the property, it's me. I said, explain to me why that's obvious. Because apparently it was obvious to her. But she said, well, obviously, she used that word again, you know, if I've been representing the property for 10 years, if somebody wants to buy it, they should talk to me. I said, what kind of agreement do you have with that property owner? Well, what do you mean? I said, you have some kind of an agreement where they've hired you, right? She said, a property management agreement. I said, which gives you the right to manage the property. It doesn't give you the right to market the property. They're two separate things, right, folks? Is that seller well within their rights to go out and hire somebody else to market the property for sale other than the firm that's marketing the property for rental? Absolutely. No question. No doubt. So, they're not the same thing. Okay? Property management fees. Property management fees are based on some percentage of income, usually based on a percentage of something called a gross effective income. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. But we want to talk about the calculation of a property management fee. Sometimes they're a fixed fee and sometimes they're a combination. But the most common way to calculate a property management fee is to look at some percentage of gross effective income Another way to say that is some percentage of rent that's actually collected. Usually the fee is going to be some percentage of rent that is actually collected in the transaction. So one of the things I want to do right now is look at how to calculate a property management fee. So let's just take an easy example first, and then I'm going to show you how that works in the bigger context of things. Let's say a property management fee, and by the way, they're usually annual fees, but sometimes they can be calculated monthly. But most of the time, property management fees are annual fees. So let's just take the most simple example first of all. A residential property. Okay? A residential property that rents for $1,800 monthly. Okay? We've got an $1,800 per month residential rental property with a 10% property management fee. Okay? If I wanted to know what the annual property management fee is, what would I need to do with that?
Multiply 1,800 times 12.
Multiply 1,800 times 12, because that's going to give me my annual rent collected, right?
Right.
And then, what do we come up with for that? What is that?
$21,600.
$21,600 in annual rent times
10%.
10% would give us $2,160 for our fee for managing that property for the year. Now, here's one of the reasons you might sometimes and often do see in residential properties particularly the fee paid on a monthly basis. Number one, the owners generally don't want to pay a $2,160 fee all at once. They'd rather pay it monthly. Number two, they only pay the fee if you've collected the what?
Right.
The rent. So most often, in residential property management, the fee is actually handled on a monthly basis when the rent comes in and is then dispersed. And by the way, where would that rent go? Where do we put money that doesn't belong to us when we handle it with our real estate broker hat on? In the trust account. Absolutely. Anytime you handle, there's one exception to that rule. And that's the easiest way to remember the rules of trust accounts and what needs to go into a trust account in North Carolina. The due diligence fee is the only time you can handle money that doesn't belong to you as a real estate broker and not have to put it into the trust account. It's the only time. How many exceptions did I just give you? One. The due diligence fee. Y'all all remember what a due diligence fee is, right? Somebody give me a definition. What's the first thing that should be a part of that definition? Non-refundable. Because that word fee means non-refundable, right? It's a non-refundable amount of money paid by the buyer directly to the seller in exchange for what? Time to look at the house, evaluate the house, and what is the seller doing during that time?
Taking it off the market.
Taking it off the market, agreeing not to sell it to anybody else during that period of time, and guaranteeing that the buyer can buy it at this price and these terms, right? That's the due diligence fee. That's the one amount of money you can handle without putting it in a trust account. You have the real estate commission's permission to take that check and get it from the buyer to the seller. Handle that money without putting it in a trust account. Any other money that you handle as a real estate broker, where do they go? In a trust account. Any other monies that you handle. So if I ask you, does rent have to go in a trust account, what's your answer?
Yes.
Do tenant security deposits have to go in a trust account?
Yes.
Do earnest money deposits have to go in a trust account?
Yes.
Do reservation fees for vacation rentals have to go in a trust account?
Yes.
Do rental fees for vacation rental properties have to go in a trust account? Yes, because the answer is all of them do except the due diligence fee. Everything else goes into a trust account. So let me ask you a more involved question that real estate brokers get wrong every day, and you probably won't be tested on something this specific, but I just want to see where your brain is. If you're managing a property, can the tenant make out the rent check to your landlord and you go deposit it in the landlord's account on a monthly basis?
No.
No, because where does rent have to go if you're collecting it?
Trust account.
In the trust account, which means the rent needs to be payable to the trust account. See how simple that is? It is a straight up and down no. You can't do it that way. Any monies you handle other than due diligence fees must always land in a trust account. That means they must always be payable to a trust account. That means if it's not payable to a trust account and it's not a due diligence fee, you're not allowed to touch it as a real estate broker. That makes sense for everybody? Okay? So pretty much unless the check's made payable to you personally, or it's a due diligence fee, or it's made payable to a trust account, you don't do what?
Touch it.
Don't touch it. You don't put your hands on it. And you explain to somebody, I can't touch that. I can't handle that money in that way. Because you're going to have landlords who want you to do that. You're going to have landlords who want you, oh, don't bother with that. They'll just make the check payable to me. I just want you to pick it up every month. No. No. Now, can you be completely out of that process? Can they make the check payable to the owner and mail it directly to the owner? Sure. Absolutely. As long as you're not handling it. Here's the thing though. What's the number one reason somebody hires a property manager? What's the number one function from an owner's perspective of a property manager? Collect rent. So essentially by doing that, they're giving up the number one thing they hired you for. And by the way, what's the number one reason you would probably take a client to court and evict them? Because they didn't pay the rent, right? And who, generally speaking, would be expected to go to court and file for eviction and do all of those things? Property manager. So now let me ask you this. You go to court. What do they call it in court when you're testifying to something that you really don't know, that you didn't see yourself, that you're having to take somebody else's word for it? Is hearsay admissible in a court of law?
It is not.
It is not. So when you go to court and you file for eviction, you say, Your Honor, they didn't pay the rent. And they say, well, how do you know they didn't pay the rent? Well, my client told me so. How's that going to fly? It's not, right? So not only by you not collecting the rent and just having the client mail it directly to the owner, are they giving up the number one function they hired you for in the first place, which is collecting the rent, they're also giving up the right to have you represent them in a court of law if that becomes necessary for something like rent collection. Does that make sense to everybody? Why that's probably not the best idea in the world. So the long and short of it is, if somebody asks you this question down the road, hey, I'm doing property management, do I need a trust account? What's the answer going to be? Yes, you do. Number one, tenant security deposit is always a no exception, goes in the trust account, right? Number two, most likely that landlord's going to want you to be collecting rent, and therefore if you're collecting it, it's got to go into the trust account. So, you know, one of the functions of a property manager, and that's also another reason, by the way, that we expect you to be a full broker, not a provisional broker, because you can't manage a trust account as a provisional broker. You got to be able to manage a trust account to do property management, so therefore you really need to be a full broker. So when we collect this property management fee, here it's expressed as an annual fee, but most likely it's going to be calculated monthly because the rent's going to come in monthly, and the owner's going to want you to disperse their portion of the rent to them and to hold back your portion, which is the property management fee. So what's that going to be monthly? That 10% fee. $180, right? It's going to be $180 monthly. So here's how the logistics of that are going to work, because you can't leave that $180 sitting in the trust account either. What do you call it if you leave your money sitting in the trust account?
Their money.
Commingling, right? What do you call it if you spend their money out of the trust account?
fraud and theft.
Well, there's another word for it, commingling. Commingling is both, right? Commingling is any time the trust account is not balanced. Anytime there's the wrong amount of money, whether it be too much or too little in a trust account, it's called commingling. And that's why I asked that question specifically, because I think sometimes when people read the definition, mixing my money with their money, they think, oh, I got too much money in there, right? Well, commingling works both ways. Because technically, if there's too little in there, you've mixed their money with your money, you've just done it in a different account, right? Or you've done it outside of the trust account. You've mixed the money that should be in the trust account, which is their money, with your money outside of the trust account. So any shortage or overage in a trust account is called commingling. And it's a bad thing. We have agents who think, oh, I had too much money in my trust account. That's not so bad. Yes, it is. Because that means somebody's money that doesn't belong in the trust account is in there. For some reason, that means you're not properly balancing your trust account. It's not a good thing. So usually, residential is going to be collected monthly, but we might see a question where it's asked, what's the property management fee yearly? Can y'all do that math? I hope you can do that math. Okay. Now that we've talked about the simplest form of calculating a property management fee, I want you guys to find for me your packet of formulas. And we're going to take a look at probably my favorite formula in the class. And the one that from tonight you're going to memorize, top to bottom, left to right, front and center, every word. This formula will become your gospel for the remainder of this class because you will use it in so many different types of math calculations for the remainder of this class. When we get to valuing income producing property later on in the class, you're going to need this formula. When we talk about calculating property management fees, you need this formula. When we get to return on investment, you need this formula. So this formula is going to be used a lot for the remainder of the class. And it needs to be one that you're very familiar with. Now, I call it the before tax cash flow formula, but that's only because that's the final destination at the end of the formula. Various other points in the book, they'll call it the formula for calculating a property management fee. And that's because somewhere in the middle here is the step where you calculate a property management fee. Later on in the book, they'll call it the formula for calculating net operating income. And that's because down here, a little bit lower, is the landing spot for net operating income. I give it to you all at one time, rather than piecemealing it. Basically, here's what this formula accomplishes. It takes all the money that goes into the bucket of an investment property at the top of the formula, and it shoots out the amount of money that's left over to go into the owner's pocket at the bottom of the formula. Does that make sense for everybody? Another way to say that is it goes from gross to net. Gross revenues, which is the money we have before we take out any expenses, all the way down to net cash flow, which is the amount of money that that owner is putting in their pocket at the end of the year as a result of owning that property. Does that make sense for everybody on a very basic level? That's the function of this formula. Now, it's important to understand how the formula works. It's also important to memorize these titles all the way through this formula. So for your homework this weekend, you're going to work on not only understanding what order these things flow in, but you're going to memorize the label gross potential income. You're going to memorize the label gross effective income or effective gross income. You're going to memorize the label net operating income and debt service and before tax cash flow, because you need to know where those things are in this formula. Basically, here's the math, and I want you to write this in on your little sheet there. Every step is minus and then equals. So gross potential income minus these vacancy and collection losses equals what? Gross effective income. And then gross effective income minus operating expenses equals net operating income. And then net operating income minus your debt service equals your before tax cash flow. So let's talk about what these labels mean and what these things really represent. The top one up there, gross potential income. Fantasy land. Doesn't exist. You know how I know it doesn't exist? It's got that word potential in there. Do any of us achieve our maximum potential? Very few of us, right? We all have a potential, but very few of us reach that potential. Properties are the same way. But we have to have a starting point, and that starting point is our gross potential income. There's two words in there that mean a lot. Gross, which means before what? Well, taxes are an example of expenses, right? So gross means before taxes and all other expenses come out. And potential means if we got the maximum we possibly could. And when we're talking about a property, the maximum we possibly could means every unit is rented at full price. And equally important to that, they're all doing what? They're all paying on time. See why it's fantasy land? Think of a 100-unit apartment complex. What are the odds that at any given time you have 100% occupancy, every single unit full, and every single one of them is current on their rent? It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Even if nothing else, you're going to have some vacancy related to turnover. People moving out, it takes a while to turn over the unit, people moving in. So you're going to have some vacancy, and you're certainly going to have some collection losses. Those are the people who aren't paying at any given time, right? So, gross potential income, rather, is as if every unit is rented and everyone is paid. And then we want to subtract our vacancy and our collection losses. Now, usually in the math problems you're going to get vacancy and or collection losses is expressed as some percentage of the gross potential income. Okay? So I'm going to write down an example of what I mean by that over here. Let's say we have an apartment complex with 20 units. And each unit rents for units rent for $800 monthly. Okay? Now one note I haven't given you yet on here, and you probably want to put this on this formula, every single one of these numbers you see in here is an annual number. When you see gross potential income, that's annually. When you see collection losses, that's annually. When you see the property management fee, that's an annual property management fee. Everything in this formula is an annual number. So what does that tell you when they give you monthly numbers in the questions? You've got to multiply by 12 and convert them instantly to annual numbers. Okay? So we've got a 20-unit apartment complex where the units rent for $800 a month. Can we calculate from that our gross potential income? Yeah. What would it be?
$16,000.
It would be $16,000 because it's $800 a month times 20 units, right? $16,000 per month in a perfect world. Because in a perfect world, we're renting all 20 of them, and all 20 are paid on time. Now, what do we need to do with that monthly number before we go crazy? Multiply it by 12. What is our gross potential income in that property?
$192,000.
$192,000. Gross potential or potential gross income. Now, if I further told you that this property had 7% vacancy, what can we now calculate? If you look at our formula, gross potential income minus vacancy equals what? gross effective income. Does everybody see that? Gross potential minus the vacancy is going to give us our gross effective income. So, 7% vacancy, you can do that one of two ways. If you want to calculate the vacancy, you would take $192,000 and multiply it by 7%. So, how much is that? I want to do that for me, 7% of 192.
13,440.
13,440. So, minus 13,440 in vacancy. And what does that give us for our gross effective income?
178,560.
178,560. Effective gross or gross effective income. Does everybody see where that comes from? Now, could I have simplified that step a little bit?
Multiplied by 0.93.
I can multiply by 0.93, which is 93%. I can also take my calculator and say 192,000 minus 7%, which would give me that same 178,560 gross effective income, right? So you're going to have to make that decision based on what they ask you for. If they ask you for the actual amount of the vacancy, you're going to have to do that number times 7%. But if they're asking for the gross effective income, you can just skip that step and do minus 7%. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. Is everybody okay on how to get to a gross effective income based on that limited information you've got right there? Now that number, that gross effective income number, is not very important to the owner. The owner cares about down here. But that number is very important to somebody. Who's that somebody?
Property manager.
The property manager. Why is that number so important to the property manager?
His fees will be based off that.
Because our fee is based off of the gross effective income. Another way to describe the gross effective income I've got on your formula here is what? It's the rent that we actually collected. And our fee is based off of that. Our fee is based off the rent that we actually collect, not the rent that we potentially collect. Nobody cares about that. It's based off the rent we actually collect, that gross effective income. So that number is very important for calculating a property management fee. So if I just built off this same little example we got working here and I said we had a 10% management fee, 10% of what?
178,560.
178,560. Does that make sense for everybody? The management fee is going to be a percentage of that gross effective income. So that's 17,856, right? So 17,856 is our management fee annually. Now, notice the management fee shows up on a line with a bunch of other expenses here, right? We call them collectively the operating expenses. The operating expenses. Things like property taxes, the property management fee, utilities, the cost of marketing the property. So if we're putting it in the newspaper, putting it on the internet, putting it in flyers. Maintenance on the property. If we need to fix things, if we've got to fix the air conditioner, if we've got to, repaint a unit, if we've got to put new carpet in a unit, all those maintenance expenses would come out of this equation at this point because those are all operating expenses. So now look back at our formula here. Gross effective income minus our operating expenses, what does that give us? A net operating income. Big change in the name of things. What changed? We no longer have the word gross. We now have the word net. Now the seller's starting, the owner's starting to care a little bit now. We get to net numbers, those start to matter a little bit to the owner. And this number is really important in chapter 17. That's what I'll tell you about this number. Because this number is going to determine the value of the property. The net operating income is the amount of revenue that a owner can expect that property to produce year after year after year. That's what the net operating income represents. Let me ask you a real high-end real estate question. Is an investor willing to pay more or less for a property that produces a higher income?
More.
More. So what you're telling me in a roundabout way is that the value of an income-producing property is directly tied to what?
It's revenue.
It's revenue. Isn't that a pretty simple concept? See, here's the thing. When we talk about value on residential properties, we talk about things like granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and we start trying to guess what buyers might be willing to pay for this and how much that's worth to this buyer and how much that one's worth, and make these all adjustments. When it's an income-producing property, the only thing that matters is how much income it produces. And that number is the net operating income. That's why that number is important, because that's going to determine the value of the property. Now, there's still a number up there that's even more important to the owner of the property. There's something I haven't talked about yet. When I talked about, I've talked about how much revenue we produce. I've talked about how many expenses we pay. What's the one thing we haven't talked about yet that somebody might be paying if they own this property?
Mortgage.
A mortgage. Notice that's not an operating expense. It's not up there. Not. That's really important. So if I ask you this question, the mortgage payment, does that affect the net operating income? What's your answer?
No.
No. Because it's after it in the formula, right? As a matter of fact, it's right after it. We call it the debt service. The net operating income minus the mortgage payment or the debt service equals what? The before tax cash flow. Or just cash flow. How much money I'm actually putting in my pocket as a result of owning this property. Because I've paid everything. I've paid the people managing the property. I've paid the taxes on the property. I've paid the maintenance on the property. I've paid my mortgage payment. Whatever's left, that's mine as the owner of the property. Does that make sense? And so here's why that number is really important. Number one, an owner wants to know how much money they're going to put in their pocket at the end of the year. But later on in the class, when we do investment math, and we start talking about a return on investment, that's their return, right? That cash flow, that money that they put in their pocket at the end of the year, that is their return on investment. So when we talk about return on investment, we're really looking at how much of their money did they put into this thing versus how much cash are they taking out of this thing. Notice I said how much of whose money they put into this thing. Their own. What does it tell you about loans? Do we consider that as part of their investment? If I go out and buy a property with 100% mortgage, how much have I invested? Nothing. If I make $1, that's an infinite return on my investment, right? Because I invested nothing. Does that make sense? And here's the reasoning for that. People say, well, no, somebody's got to pay that mortgage. Yes. What's paying the mortgage? The property is, right? The mortgage is already taken care of by the time we get down here to this before tax cash flow. So loans are completely washed out in this process. We simply don't care about loans in this process. It's taken care of in the formula. So later on in the class, you'll be ready to go. When we get to this investment math stuff, you'll understand it's just a comparison of how much money they get out at the end versus how much of their own money they put in at the beginning. So if we say somebody bought a $100,000 property, but they only made a $10,000 down payment, what's their actual investment in the property? $10,000. And here's why that matters. Let's say their before tax cash flow is only $1,000 on that property. Well, if they were making $1,000 on a $100,000 investment, that'd be a terrible use of their money, right? But if they're only investing or pulling out of their pocket $10,000 and they're getting $1,000 out at the end of the year, That's a 10% return on there. Is that a pretty good return on your
I
money?
know, it's a very good.
That's a great return on your, do you see the difference there? It's the same property, but you have to go and think about it in a different regard. My investment is not the purchase price. My investment is how much money I actually pull out of my own pocket. My return is not the net operating income. My return is how much I actually put into my own pocket. And this is jumping the gun a lot. But I find it's better to do it now and have you get comfortable with that, so when we get to the math of it later on, you're comfortable with the concepts. Fair enough? So, based on that, got a little worksheet. Technically, it's not a bank. Technically, they are a credit union. SECU is one of the few that has financial institutions that has figured out, and at least they figured it out a lot earlier than some other financial institutions, that in the foreclosure process they come out a lot better by making those improvements. Because so many buyers depend on the property being perfect when they buy it, because they're financing it. And there's a big difference. These shows that are on HGTV, they drive me back, out of my mind crazy. House Hunters is the dumbest crap to ever hit the airwaves. Because nobody shops for houses like that. I mean, forget the whole thing of we're going to look at 3 houses and you have to choose one. My job would be wonderful if it worked that way, you know. But they look at, you know, oh, this house is, your budget is $550, and this house is $450, so that means you've got $100,000 left to spend on renovations. Well, only if you were paying cash for the $550. That's not the way, you know, those little old ladies on the commercial, that's not how any of this works. That's the way I feel every time I look at one of those shows. Because most likely somebody who has a budget of $550, they're probably only putting 10 or 20% down of that $550, right? So they may only have $50,000 to put into the transaction, and just because the house is $450, they still have to put $45,000 down. Well, where does that extra $100,000 in floating cash come from? And the answer is, it doesn't exist. And so most buyers in today's marketplace need the property to be fairly close to what they want before they'll buy it, because they don't have the cash on hand, and it's not easy to finance renovations until the bank's happy to lend you money after the renovations are done. Good luck finding somebody to do all that work without getting paid for it until they're finished, right? And that's always the catch-22 of renovating a house. It's, how do I get the money to do the renovation when I can't borrow the money until the renovation's done, you know? And so with SECU, they figured out early on into that process that, yeah, we can foreclose on this property and carpet's, you know, roached out and looks ratty and terrible, and they took the appliances with them and they ripped the fixtures off the wall, and we'll sell it for $100,000. Or we can spend $30,000 of our own money on fixing it up and sell it for $150, because the buyers are willing to pay that premium for it because they can now finance that price. And with interest rates where they are, you know, to borrow $1,000, it costs you about $4 a month. So what would a buyer rather have? Would they rather have to spend $30,000 out of their own pocket when they're a first-time home buyer, or would they rather have a $120 a month higher house payment? I can tell you what the reality is. They'd rather have a $120 a month higher house payment. So SECU is absolutely smart to do it that way. And some of the other banks have finally caught on and are doing some of those things. You don't see as many foreclosures in just horrible shape as you used to. But SECU's been doing it for a long time. Okay? All right? Renting the property, set the rental rates. That's a big part of renting out income-producing properties, is making sure that you have rental rates that are going to make you competitive. Now, here's the thing, and this kind of goes sort of counterintuitive a little bit. If I ask you this question, is 100% occupancy a good thing? What do you think most people would say?
Sure. Yes.
Sure. It's not. Unless you're talking about managing a small number of properties. You know, because if you're only managing 4 properties, the difference between 100% and 75% is one property, right? You probably want to be at 100 rather than 75. But if I'm managing 100 properties, I'd rather have 95% occupancy than 100% occupancy. Because if I'm at 100%, it means I'm probably charging too little. And it doesn't give me the flexibility to make any more, because if somebody comes along that needs to rent something, I don't have anywhere to put them. If somebody moves out, I can't stay at 100% reasonably all the time because somebody needs to move out and that unit's going to sit vacant for a couple of months. Whereas if I'm at 95% occupancy, new person comes in, I put them in one of the vacant units that's already ready to go. There's no wait, there's no downtime, and person moves out and I have time to turn that unit. So ideally you want to set the rental rates to where they're just high enough that you're barely below 100% occupancy so that you have that float room. So that's a big part of setting rental rates. You want to be a little bit less than 100% in a perfect world. And it depends on the size of the property and the type of the property too. All right? And you're going to shop it around and make sure you're not overcharging or undercharging based on your property. Selecting tenants, this is an important danger area. And we're going to talk about this a lot in the fair housing chapter, but what you should know about selecting tenants is use financial criteria. If you use financial criteria, you will very rarely go wrong. If you use anything else, you're asking for trouble. And my advice to you would be, if you go into property management, is to have the financial criteria, whatever they are, clearly available for the tenant before they even apply. Don't make it a surprise to them when they get rejected. You know, when I have a potential tenant fill out a lease application, I give them, you must have this credit score, you must have this monthly income, and you must have a clean rental history for the last 5 years. Those are my musts. And you know, that credit score and that monthly income will vary based on the property and the area and the price point and all those things. But I'm very clear about those things. And the other thing I do as a property manager, and I'm not saying this is what the law says, but I'm saying it's the way I have kept myself out of trouble and what I recommend to folks, is only process one application at a time when you're a property manager. And as soon as somebody applies that meets your stated criteria, they're in. Here's the problem you're going to run into. If you process 5 applications, what do you do when 4 of them meet your criteria?
And you pick somebody.
Now you got to pick somebody. On what basis? It becomes very subjective, right? Because here's all it takes. Quinn was one of those 4 who got approved, but she didn't get the property. Karen did. Karen has no children. Quinn has 3. Might it sneak into Quinn's mind that they didn't take her because she has kids and they're afraid the kids might mess up their house? Might it sneak into their mind? Guess who was a protected class under federal fair housing law? Children under the age of 18. And if you make a housing decision based on the presence or absence of children under the age of 18, you just committed a fair housing violation. And the fair housing rules are so lax that they don't have to prove you actually did it. They just have to prove that they believe you did it for that reason. And you can be found guilty of a fair housing violation. So that's what I mean when I say process one application at a time. Because if I process one application at a time, and if Karen and Quinn both applied for that apartment, and Karen applied first, and her application matched the criteria, when Quinn says to me, well, why didn't I get it? I'm going to say, because I never processed your application. I have no idea if you were approved or not, because we found an acceptable tenant before we even processed your application, because we processed the applications in the order that they came in until we found a suitable tenant. You see how I have immediate cover. I'm not choosing, I'm not picking among the tenants. Now, your property owners may not want to hear that, because they may want to say, take the one with the highest credit score. That's great, and that's a legal thing to do. You can take the one with the highest credit score, but in their mind, that's not going to be why you didn't choose them. It's going to be some other thing. And that other thing usually can get you in trouble. So be very careful about how you select tenants. Mainly use financial criteria. That's really the best advice I can give. Collect rent, that's obviously a big job of a property manager. Remember I said you need a trust account for that. Perform any of the landlord's duties, and that includes maintenance. One of the hardest lessons for landlords to learn sometimes is that maintenance is largely out of their hands once they hire a property manager. Some landlords don't want you spending their money. Then don't hire me. your property management agreement should have some, statement or agreement about how much of a repair that the property manager is authorized to make on their own without the approval from the landlord. Well, I have that in my property management agreement, but I also further put in an email if it's going to be more than that, I'll put in an email. When I email that client, I'll say, Gary, I just called you and left you a message. I texted you, and I wanted to let you know in this email that the heat went out over on Foxfire, and it's going to be down to 12 degrees tonight. So I've already got the HVAC people ready to go out there. If I don't hear back from you by 5 o'clock this afternoon, I'm going to approve that repair. So even though that's above the amount I've been authorized to spend, my job is to protect the landlord's interest in every possible way, and that includes performing necessary maintenance on the property. And so sometimes you have to have tough conversations with your landlord and say, you know what, I'm the one on ground zero. I have to be able to make those calls. And if you have a landlord that's resistant to you making those calls, it's probably time to think about not managing their property, because they're going to put you in a bad situation. Okay? Maintaining the property, we want to talk about the different types of maintenance. In your book on page 267, they break down property maintenance into different categories. And we want to talk about those and make sure you know the difference. First of all, the kind of maintenance we want to be doing as a property manager is the first one, preventative maintenance. Preventative maintenance is by far the cheapest type of maintenance. It also happens to be the hardest one to convince your property owner to do. How many times have I heard the old expression, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? That does not apply when it comes to property management. There are plenty of things that need to be taken care of before they get to the point of being broke. And you'll learn that matters not only from an expense perspective, but it matters from a headache perspective on your part. Because if you see something that's deteriorating, you wait till it completely breaks, you're going to get a 3 o'clock in the morning phone call and have to deal with it then. Whereas if you kind of walk through the property once every few months and make notes about things that look like they need to be taken care of and go ahead and take care of them, it will, number one, be cheaper. And it will avoid upset tenant 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls, which are not fun for anybody. I've gotten them before. I don't want to get them again. I had a golf ball go through a window at one of my properties yesterday. As soon as I told, here's the great things you get as a property manager. I called the landlord and I told him, I said, Gary, this house is in Northridge over off of Falls of the News Road, and the house is it's a golf course lot, but the backyard is probably from me to the street out there. So we're talking a big yard. You got to be a really bad shot to hit this house with a golf ball, and to hit it with enough force that it went through both panes of a double pane window. And I told Gary, the owner, I said, Gary, we got a broken window over at the house. I've got glass doctor on the way out there tomorrow. I'm going to go over and make sure we get some cardboard put in the window tonight. But we've got to get it fixed because it's through both panes. So it's got to be taken care of sooner rather than later. The first thing he said to me was, I'm sure it's my brother. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, oh yeah, my brother's a member of the club over there, and we haven't talked to him for 10 years, and he thought he was going to inherit the house. I'm pretty sure he did it on purpose. And it turns out that's exactly who it was. The guy just teed off and hammered a golf ball through the back window of the property. So these are the kinds of things you encounter as a property manager. Now, I said to him, it would be nice to have known that in advance. Maybe I can tell the tenants to wear helmets when they're in the sunroom. I don't know. But so you never know what you're going to run into with property management, and you have to be prepared. Part of being a property manager is having a list all the time of who can I call when this happens. Because insert X here, it will happen eventually if you're managing property. And you don't really have a whole lot of time to be scrambling trying to find somebody that you can trust. And have a good handyman that you can trust to do anything. Even if they can't fix it, they'll tell you, this is who you need, this is what you need. Have that person and make sure that person has a key to the property. Because you don't want to have to go over there at 2 o'clock in the morning to open the door. So, yeah, right. They make it. You got to have them, don't you?
Yeah.
You just have to. You just have to. So, Corrective maintenance is the kind of maintenance we would prefer not to be doing. That's when something's broken. Preventative maintenance is before it breaks. Corrective maintenance is after it's broken. We're fixing it. And then we have routine maintenance, which is pretty self-explanatory. Routine maintenance is just things like painting and normal day-to-day activities of maintaining a property. Okay. Handling environmental concerns, the property manager should be knowledgeable about whatever environmental concerns there might be. Remember, property management is just not homes. It could be a property like a shopping center, for example. And if you're managing something like a shopping center, you need to be aware of like stormwater runoff, as an example. If you're managing an industrial building, you need to be aware of whatever chemicals the tenants are using in the building and how they're disposing of those chemicals and what the rules and regulations are. So that's going to be determined by the kind of property you're managing. And be able to respond to any problem that might come up during the management of that property. Okay? The Americans with Disabilities Act is addressed on page 268, going into page 269. And we talk about it here because property managers are very often responsible for dealing with the Americans with Disabilities Act and making sure that they're in compliance. First thing you need to know about the ADA when it comes to real estate is that it only applies to places of public accommodation. We generally think of those as commercial real estate, but any place of public accommodation. Is this classroom a place of public accommodation? Yes. So does the ADA apply to this classroom, for example? It absolutely does. You know, to run a real estate school, we have to make sure that we're either on ground level or have elevator access to the level where the classrooms are. The bathrooms have to be handicap accessible. They made us change the doorknobs in the entire first floor from doorknobs with handles to doorknobs with the push levers, for example, when we moved into this building. You know, doors have to swing outward versus inward into rooms. You know, so those are all things that you'll have to deal with as a property manager when working with ADA compliance. The big thing is to keep in mind that the ADA only applies to places of public accommodation. So that would not include, for example, single-family homes. If you were managing single-family homes, the ADA is not going to be in effect there. But if you're managing something like an apartment complex, the apartments themselves would not need to be ADA compliant, but things like the hallways, the clubhouse, the amenities, the parking lot, all those things would need to be ADA accessible.
But a person who has a disability can make reasonable accommodations at their expense in your property.
Yes, and that gets more into federal fair housing law than the Americans with Disabilities Act, because if we're talking about I'm assuming you're talking about like a residential property, right? So residential properties, we do not have to comply with the ADA. Here's the difference between the fair housing laws and the ADA. The ADA puts the responsibility of paying for compliance on the property owner. So the responsibility for a place of public use is that the property owner pays to make it accessible. The fair housing laws guarantee accessibility to persons who have handicapping conditions as well. The difference is the person with the handicapping condition is expected to pay for that accessibility, not the owner of the property. So that's really the big primary difference between fair housing law and the ADA. With the ADA, it's the property owner who pays. With the fair housing law, it's the tenant who pays for the accommodation. But you're exactly right, Tracy. If you rent out a single-family home and they need an accommodation made, you cannot refuse the accommodation. As long as they're willing to pay for it, as long as they're willing to pay to put it back in some circumstances. Some circumstances, they don't have to put it back. The general rule of thumb is if it's outside the property, they don't have to put it back like it was. So like a ramp, for example. If they take downstairs and put up a ramp, they do not have to change that back. Anything outside the property, they generally don't have to put back. Anything inside the property, they only have to put back if it's going to diminish the use of a future occupant. So for example, if you have a tenant who comes in and they're in a wheelchair and they need wider doorways in the house. They can pay to have wider doorways put in the house, but they will not have to pay to have them put back as they originally were, because wider doorways don't diminish the use for a future occupant. Does that make sense? Whereas if they're in a wheelchair and they need to remove the lower kitchen cabinets so that they can roll under the countertops and be able to work on the work surfaces and access the sink and all those things, you can require them to put that back, because that does diminish the use for a future occupant because there are fewer cabinets. So that's kind of how it works on the fair housing side. Whereas on the ADA side, you would just be required to make that accommodation. If it was for example, an office building, you're going to have a sink that they can use. You're going to have a restroom that they can use. You're going to have either elevator access or ground floor access to all the services. And keep in mind that ADA compliance can be accomplished in a number of ways depending on the age of the building. If the building's old enough, they don't force you to bring it in compliance in every case. They do force you to make an accommodation that makes it accessible. For example, my hometown, I grew up in a little town called Tarboro in eastern North Carolina, and the post office in Tarboro was built in the 1815, 1816 range. And it's this huge granite, beautiful building, but because it's right on the Tar River, they built it about 30 feet off of street level, so when the river flooded, it wouldn't flood the post office. And so it has these grand granite steps that go up to the front of this building, but they are steep and there's a lot of them to get up there. And there's no elevators in this building, so their ADA compliance consists of a car horn. If you need assistance, you drive around to the back of the building where they load the mail trucks, and you blow your horn until somebody comes out, and they will get your post office box key and they will run up there and get your mail for you and run it back down to you. And the federal government says that that is enough of a compliance effort to make it accessible to everybody. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the building itself always has to be 100% in compliance, but if it's not, you do have to make accommodations to make it usable for everybody. But most of the time, if the building's newer at all, it's going to fall under the building itself has to be in compliance. Okay? Risk management as a property manager. Big thing is to avoid risk wherever possible. And the other big one is to transfer risk. How do we transfer risk? Insurance. That's what insurance is. Insurance is a way to transfer risk from me or my property owner to the insurance company. If you're reading ahead in your book, don't read the property insurance chapter. We don't cover that any longer. That's been officially taken out. We used to have to teach a lot more about insurance, and we don't have to teach that any longer. Yeah, there's one thing you can mark off your list. No property insurance. So we used to have to teach you that the part of the risk that you retained was your deductible. You know, because that's the piece of the risk that you still take on is the deductible. We don't have to teach you that. So transferring risk is the purpose of insurance. Okay? It's true or false? In preparing the operating budget, the property manager would take into consideration the owner's long-range plan for the property. You think that's true or false?
True.
True. A low vacancy rate means that the property is being well managed.
False.
False, not necessarily. You'd have to look at all the other factors combined to see. It's probable that the manager of a large office building is licensed either as a property manager or as a broker. So it's probable that the manager of a large office building is usually a property manager or a broker. What do you think? Is that probably true?
False.
I think it's probably true.
Because they be a broker?
They do have to be a broker, right? Licensed as a property manager or / broker. It's all one inclusive thing. Okay, that's probably true, because the only exception to that rule would be what? If they are the salaried employee of the owner of the property and that owner is a corporation. Okay? Probably the most important function performed by a property manager is selecting tenants. Is that true or false? False. What's the most important function? Maintain the value of the property. These are the kinds of questions you see on the national section of the exam about property management. That's kind of why I've given you some of these assorted questions here. Property managers are usually agents of the owners, true or false?
True.
True, yeah. True. The property manager usually is responsible for making sure the property conforms to ADA rules. Is that true or false?
True.
True, absolutely. I had somebody say, but not if it's not a place of public accommodation. I said, that's true. They still have a requirement to make sure it complies with ADA rules. They just know that if it's not a place of a public accommodation, the ADA rules what? Do not apply. They're still in compliance with them, they just know they don't apply. That's it.